I'll work on that while you get started. Ryan Galt is our featured speaker this afternoon. He's from the Department of Agricultural Sustainability and Society, a relatively new program, and his interests are in agriculture, in society, and the environment, and the way that he can weave interconnections between them. But as I mentioned earlier, he's also done a lot of important work that all of us can learn from about ways of assessing our students and to determine learning outcomes for our students. And so I'm going to now give the mic over to Ryan Galt, who will be presenting a talk called Rethinking Course Design Through Building Student Competencies, Process, Implementation, and Outcomes. Ryan Galt.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. The projector is definitely not on as far as I can tell, but it'll get on soon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, maybe. Is it on?
I don't think it is, but
that's just for the camera.
Okay. I was gonna say if I can't speak to this size audience, I'm in trouble. So before the projector gets going, I wanted to. Well, one slight correction is I'm in the Department of Human and Community Development, but I'm also a Provost Fellow with the Agricultural Sustainability Institute, and so that's my affiliation on campus. And upon getting my position here, one of the things that my position was dependent upon was teaching for the new Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems major, which is still in the works, but getting very close to being approved all the way. So one of the classes that was conceived of being taught before was a food systems class. And it's a class I had never taken because I'd always wanted a class like that, but it never had existed. But it was something I was extremely excited about teaching. So it meant then that I got to be fairly creative in that I wasn't being based on any of my own previous individual classes, but rather drawing from a lot of, drawing from a lot of previous classes that I've taken in a way to kind of build a more comprehensive whole in terms of the whole food system. And so what I'll be talking about briefly will be a brief introduction to my teaching philosophy, which has been developing fits and starts over time. Then go into competencies, what they are and how they might work in a classroom situation. And then talk about the class in particular and how competencies worked as essentially kind of laying the groundwork for everything that came after in terms of that course design, going through that process, looking at the competencies, which you have a handout for, and then talk about implementation and outcomes. And then we'll be interspersing our comments and thoughts as we go. So I read a very influential book for me this summer, which was Ken Bain's What the Best College Teachers Do. And it's a case study, in essence, or many case studies of some of the most influential college teachers over about 10 years. Very interesting book. And a lot of the things that he talks about in there are things that resonated with me in terms of what I've been thinking about importance of teaching philosophy. But he grounds it a lot in pedagogical theory and in research. And so some of the things that he says is that teachers understand that knowledge is socially constructed, meaning that it's a human activity to create knowledge. And second, that this is one thing I definitely didn't understand until reading the book, was mental models change slowly. I was thinking that somehow just by telling students something that would change the way they were thinking about it. So this was important for me. That's why I have the asterisk there. The other two things that he talks about is how learning is based fundamentally on interests. So what is it that students are interested in? If you can engage those interests, you can really help them kind of deepen their learning process. And also that learning is based on questions. Because most of us as researchers are engaged in answering questions, and we can kind of extend our own excitement for the research process to students who are then, if we can show them questions and have them think about questions, can also become engaged scholars in kind of trying to answer those questions also. So much more generally, coming out of Modesto Junior College as a freshman and sophomore, one of the things that happened to me was I found a teacher had an extremely large impact on how I thought about the world. And he essentially, in his classes, had transformed me from essentially a received knowledge learner, that is, you, teacher, tell me what to think, and I will think it for you and then repeat it back to you, to a lifelong learner in which I could actually start to pose my own questions and then try to answer those questions on my own and, of course, with the help of others and other resources. So I was drawing historically I've been drawing on his precedent for me as a teacher, but having read Ken Bain's work and many other people's work now, I can see kind of the philosophical roots of his teaching style are much deeper than just what he was doing. There's a lot to back that up, in essence. And so one of my goals as a teacher then is to have students understand their values and their interests, use analysis, including evidence and argumentation, in order to think about and inform their actions and the choices that they take, and then also to develop and employ critical consciousness about how the world got to be the way it is now, and how we as individuals within a society are supposed to act and do things in that context. So I'm probably speaking too fast, which I tend to do. So I do apologize for that. Let me make a note, though. If you have questions or thoughts, please interrupt me at any time. I'm certainly willing and interested in engaging in more than just monologue. So the why competencies? I was extremely skeptical of competencies at the beginning. In a way, I didn't think my teaching could be reduced to little individual pieces that could inform how students were doing things. I thought there was something much bigger than that. There was some kind of majestic or magical whole that couldn't be reduced to specific things and tasks that students could do. I got over that eventually, but it took a while, and actually became a big fan of competencies. But the way of thinking about competencies from what I've read about them is that they're essentially a combination of skill and knowledge put towards a specific task. So you're asking students to do something using knowledge to accomplish some sort of outcome. And what I eventually learned was that by trying to be explicit about competencies, we can help take learning in our courses beyond the absorption of class material into a way of combining knowledge and action together in some sort of concrete tasks so that they can arguably get to a deeper kind of learning. We can debate that certainly, I think, but I think that's the case. The Department of Education has this diagram of what competencies are relative to many other things. One of the basic things in terms of foundation for all learners are our individual biological and social traits and characteristics. Built upon that, as we go about learning in classroom and outside of classroom, we develop skills, abilities, and knowledge. And then competencies, and take that into a specific kind of direction in which you integrate those skills and that knowledge to perform specific tasks. And then what we usually do as teachers is to actually assess those things through demonstration. So that is the things that students actually turn in are the things we give them grades on. Arguably, though, competencies are much broader, and they're not easy to actually assess entirely from the demonstrations themselves, I would argue. So it's a bigger subset that we actually can't get at all the time as teachers. So how then, this didn't turn out too well, did it? One way of thinking about learning is through David Kolb's learning cycle. And what he proposes is that everyone goes through the same learning cycle in which we have a concrete experience, for example, and then we reflect that on that experience. And then we conceptualize on that experience, and then we do something based on experimentation, trying to manipulate something, and then we go back and cycle through as we go about learning. Academics tend to fall over here, as you might expect. I certainly do. I'm kind of over here. But that doesn't, but what Kolb argues is that fundamentally we need to practice both things. So we need to think about the way we take in experience is important to do it in the concrete, but also in terms of the abstract. And then when we try to process or deal with that actual experience, we need to do it in both ways as well. On the more concrete side, by actively experimenting with things, and then on the reflective side or the abstract side as well. So his argument then ultimately is if we are using both kind of the concrete and the abstract modes of taking in experience, and similarly of dealing with experience, then we can expand our potential to learn. It's Kolb's argument. So how does this all relate back to competencies then? The way that I think about it is if we're going to learn or learn more deeply, then us and students, we need to, of course, think. We need to act and experiment. We need to experience, and then we need to reflect. And then we do that in iterative cycles throughout the class and throughout our lives, of course. And so one way that competencies are really useful here is that by combining both the action or the skills and the knowledge, you actually get at an integration of some of these things and bring them together in one specific kind of task. So that then is kind of the philosophical preview the thought that's going into design of the course, which we'll talk about briefly here. So the course material, this is far too dense as a slide, but we're doing a lot of material. That's one of the points of that. We're not just asking students to do things, but actually we're making them learn a lot of content knowledge as well. But that's not all we're doing. So you don't need to read all that, but it's just to get at that point. I definitely need water. So there's a number of components to the class that are, I guess, fairly atypical in some fashion. So the exams are one of them. And the exams, I give them to students 4 weeks in advance. And what they have to do for me then, they're fairly large essay questions. They have to create outlines that answer these questions by drawing together everything we've been doing in class, everything they've been reading, things we've been doing in lab, and their own experiences and thoughts and analysis, and outline those and create those. And then they get approved by one of our TAs or myself. And if they get all of their outlines approved for all the questions, they get to choose which one they want to write their essay on. So that way, with the outlines, we're making sure that they're dealing with all the material, but then they get to choose which one they feel most prepared for if they've decided to go through the process of preparing for them all. This is based on a number of premises, but we can have, Jenna, I don't know if you want to speak to the exams because...
My name is Jenna. Sorry. Oh, yeah. You want to come over by the ambient mic? So my name's Jenna, and I was a student this past fall in the CRD 20 course. And for me, the exams really just, they got at to what a heart of what an exam should be, because they were a synthesis of information rather than a lot of my classes now are just like a regurgitation of information that we've memorized. So for example, in my bio class, we learn a bunch of information, and you take a midterm, and then you learn a bunch of information, and then you take a midterm. But in Ryan's class, because it was such a synthesis of everything that we've been doing, like you get a whole picture idea from the end of the class, which is really important to me as a student.
And so, yeah, so that basically the exams, we can skip over some of that. In terms of the labs, we had 1 3-hour session each week for every student, and the TAs led those. And so, Jesse, if you want to speak to those.
Sure. My name's Jessie, and I'm a master's student in community development, and I was one of the 3 TAs. Ryan had 3 TAs for a class of, how many students were there total?
35.
35.
Thanks to the
So it was a pretty
largesse
extraordinary
of
experience of being able to have a one-on-one intimate relationship with all the people who were in my lab, and I had 3 hours a week to work with the students in what we call the lab, and which is interesting because it's a social science course, and social science courses don't usually have labs. But it was in a social science type of way, it was a really good period of time or amount of time for students to be able to grapple more hands-on with all the concepts that we were going through in class. And I think Ryan will describe more in depth what we were doing during the labs. But having that amount of time in a social science class rather than a 50-minute period where students come in, there's 30 of them, you don't really get to get into it with a discussion session. It was, I think, a pretty extraordinary experience.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the most valuable pieces of the class for me. I think mostly because it was one of the most unique pieces of the class, because it was a social science class, and labs are generally like restricted to the biophysical side of sciences. So it really changed that, that methodology in my opinion.
Yeah. And so the lab outline then is this, in which we do a bunch of things in lab, and then we do field trips every other lab. In every field trip, essentially what they're doing is they get to decide where they want to go based on guidelines and lists that we give them. They prepare research questions in which they're interested in answering through being able to interview the people who are part of that social unit that we're going to. And then they create interview questions. They do the interviews while we're on the field trip, and then they prepare presentations and give presentations back to the lab. And then we get ready again to do that again. So they cycle through that research process actually 4 times throughout the course of the lab in different locations in different parts of the food system. And so we go to the student farm. This is behind the scenes, of course, at the Coho in its current manifestation. We got to go to the meat slaughter facility and meat science laboratory, which was an amazing experience. Out to various farms in the Cape Bay Valley and other places. Also urban farm in Sacramento. Olive oil processing facility by Mike Madison. Budweiser processing facility, slightly different scale. We did a day-long field trip to the Bay Area that was really exciting, including the Oakland Food Walk, which is where they produce a huge amount of processed food happens in Oakland. And you said you wanted to talk.
I just wanted to share one moment out of the class. We had a lab scheduled on a holiday, and it just didn't come to the attention until we were getting close to that day. And so Ryan had suggested who wanted to take the holiday out and actually just do the lab anyway. And 90% of the class was like, oh, me, I'd rather take my day off of school and do more school. I think it just reflects back to how engaged the entire class was because of the teaching methods.
So we had 60% of the class, 75% of the class, somewhere in between there. I don't remember where the exact number was. We took a day-long field trip to the Bay Area and did Bay Area food systems. So we did the Oakland Food Walk, which was more food processing. We went to Food First, which is a research and think tank in the Bay Area that does food-related work. We went to Veritable Vegetable, which is one of the largest distribution companies of organic and sustainable foods in the country. And we got to have in-depth interviews and conversations with all the different people along the way. So they got to practice, like in that iterative cycle that we were talking about with the labs. They got to formulate research questions and then be able to practice them in the real world, come back, synthesize them, put them together, give a presentation. And by the time we did this, people were like, no problem. I totally know how to be a social science researcher out in the real world, doing something I'm interested in. It's awesome.
It was a lot of fun. This is one of the just, from the distributor, going inside of their refrigeration units was really exciting. And then going to various sales places of food as well. And we had dinner together ultimately at the end of that field trip, which was really fun. And at the very end, of course, what happens to food and waste, many students decided they wanted to go to the landfill to see more, which is a very, very powerful experience for students to kind of go and stand on where their trash is going to be for the next tens of thousands of years. So this is, of course, the leachate pond as well. So we did a lot of things, arguably too much. We could get Jenna's opinion on that. But certainly I think most students felt we were asking too much of them. But at the same time, there was a lot of engagement, so it made for really interesting relationships. So we did a learning style assessment, which they try to figure out if they're visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and what combinations. Team projects were all based on these field trips and based on group work. And then we took the teams, mixed them up at the end, and made them try to synthesize about various locations using various perspectives. They did a food diary in which they collect data on their food consumption over 2 days and then try to figure out, just taking one piece of that, one ingredient, where it comes from, and what might be some environmental and social impacts of that. A reading journal in which they dialogue with the readings. A learn document at the end, which is essentially putting together all their experiences in the class and then reflecting on it, about how their learning process went, what they learned from the class. And then the activities that we did in class are these various ones. The one I want to highlight is the competency self-assessment, which is what is kind of the foundation of the class. Is that really loud to everyone, that whistling? Or is that okay? Okay. So how then did we get to all of these pieces and put them all together? It was a fairly long process in which I was dialoguing for almost a year with Damien Parr, who was a student of education at the time and is now a postdoc at ASI. And we went through a process in which a lot of folks were involved, and it was based on previous research as well. So having never had a food systems class, what was very nice is that a bunch of research had been done to identify the skills, content, and experiences that students in a new sustainable agriculture and food systems major should have. So I had that and those pieces that Damien and many others have been working on. And then I decided to look at some other sustainability curricula. And Michigan State University, for example, has a minor in which you can get kind of a sustainability certification. So I looked at their competencies there. And then I thought back to all of my undergraduate and graduate school experience and thought, what were the most powerful learning experiences and things that I got best out of school? So that created, I synthesized all of those things to create a list of competencies, and then brainstormed with Damien and also with Laurie Thorpe at Michigan State University to try to take my big list, which was far too broad, and try to make it into very specific kinds of tasks and categories, which you can see on one of the handouts that I gave you. That giant table, in essence, is the outcome of this process. So I got that through refining those competencies, what I want students to get out. I made the final list of competencies, and then that informed, over time, the assignments and the activities that we then created. So we could make sure that each of the activities we're asking them to do would somehow enable them to develop some of those competencies that we had identified before. And so that's how we eventually get to the final course materials, which are based, if you will, on that substructure of the competencies that are identified beforehand. And so you have this handout, but the way that I decided to group the competencies were by ways of knowing and learning, understanding values, the inquiry process in terms of social science, analysis, interpersonal skills, writing, and presenting. And so instead of going through all of those right now, which I have slides to do, I think since you have the handout, we don't need to deal with every single one. But if you want to make any comments on any of these.
Sure. So one of the really important things, and I think students came away with this because we got it in a lot of our evaluations, was the ways of knowing and learning, which is really not often addressed in an academic setting. We are preoccupied with the course material rather than the way that people can absorb the course material. So we actually spent almost an entire lab at the very beginning going through the ways that the students in the individual labs, the way that they learn and the way that they come to know what they know. And so we had a fairly rudimentary structure. We didn't go with, last year they went with Kolb's learning style, and it was far too complex because it involves all kinds of matrices and diagrams, and it's the first day of class and people were really confused. So we simplified it down to auditory, kinesthetic, and visual, and we had a large conversation during that first lab about the way that people identified and how they learned best. So what types of interests they had and how they learned from those interests, what classes they liked best, like drawing on personal experiences from each of the class. And we had different activities that got students up and moving around the class into their different groups and then sharing with people that they identified most with so that they could figure out where their weak points were and where their strengths were. And then we eventually ended up grouping the students. Oh, Jeremy, you want to talk about it?
I just have one comment that learning how to use the different theoretical lenses. So in lab we were assigned a different theoretical lens, either a feminist research lens, a political economic, or a purely positivist lens. And learning how to do that was really helpful to me as in this, because as I'm learning more about social science, I've started during this quarter when I was in the class, I started to feel myself sink into this sort of moral relativism and just questioning what I know so much that everything started to be meaningless, or it started to seem impossible that anything that I thought I knew, I was just using some value system that I had absorbed passively, and that started to freak me out. So learning in the labs how to effectively use these theoretical lenses and how to be explicit about the values that I'm using to evaluate a question was one of the most helpful things on a larger educational scale, not just useful in the class, but useful in other areas too. So.
Yeah, so that was definitely one of the main competencies that we were looking to achieve in this class, which is the ways of knowing. How do you come to know what you know, and where do you come from when you're seeking to understand an answer? So that was like level 2. First was getting to know how people learned, and then level 2 was creating these bodies of knowledge, these lenses to look through, so students could understand that it makes a great deal of difference where you're coming from when you're starting to understand and know something.
And Ben Orloff, who was presenting here just, I think it was 2 weeks ago, talked about one of his classes briefly, in which he said, in essence, it's a paradigm class in which students are introduced into different kinds of paradigms. And then, so I didn't realize that Ben and I were doing the same thing until I came to his presentation. But it's very similar in terms of how we've gone about trying to get students to understand those different paradigms and then operationalize them in some fashion. Yeah, we can skip through a lot of those individual competencies. And then wanted to talk about implementation. So in essence, that list of competencies served as a kind of a grounding of each of the activities and assignments that I thought might be fun to do, because there was a lot of thought as to what we can do in the course. But when it came down to it, one of the questions I would ask was, if we do this thing, does it hit a number of competencies that I really want the students to get out of this class? Or am I just kind of throwing it at them because I think it's kind of cool, but I don't necessarily know why? Because I have a tendency to do that too. So I wanted to check that a little bit and say maybe I should ground it in some further thought, which was very helpful for me. And so the activities and assignments, and we were trying to design them in a way which we could say, well, they're definitely going to be developing student competency in some fashion. They're going to be assessing student learning in terms of a demonstration that we can then grade, and then they're hopefully going to assess how we're doing as teachers as well. So are they getting the things that we're asking them to get? And that's a fairly tall order for all assignments, and I would say certainly doesn't apply to all of them. Jesse, did you have something to say on the implementation?
No, you're good. It's okay. We can keep going.
Go through that once again. In terms of outcomes, what I want to deal with most is the student self-assessment. And that's the handout that you have, kind of the big table piece. So there, then we'll do course evaluations briefly. I chopped that, but everything else we'll have. So the way then to try to get at competencies was a big question for me. And whether or not competencies should be linked to grades was another big question for me. And I didn't know the answer to that until close to the kind of getting close to teach, in which I decided that I couldn't actually make the competencies part of the grades in and of themselves. And I'll explain a little bit why. So the demonstrations are essentially what we think about in terms of instructor assessment of student performance. So with those demonstrations, with the things I was asking them to turn in, those are the things I felt we could reliably grade in some fashion based on rubrics that were shared with the students beforehand. The competencies, since it's a much bigger set of things than the demonstrations themselves, we decided to go with self-assessment as the way to try to measure those in any kind of fashion. Because otherwise it would be extremely labor intensive for us to try to sit down and assess them in some kind of independent way rather than students having done it. And also if we give students the power and the ability to start thinking about assessing themselves, then they can take those into further life experiences. The question, what do I know now? What don't I know? How am I doing? Those kind of questions might come out more so in life after college. So this is a fairly complex data set. So what I want to do is explain what's going on here. And then you can use your handout essentially as a key, because I know you won't be able to read all this. So the first self-assessment at the very beginning of the quarter, before we did anything in the class, I had students assess where they felt their level of development for each of these competencies was. If they felt it was preparatory, very beginning, not really ready to do things with. Intermediate, in terms of ready to go, kind of, but still missing a lot. Advanced or mastery. And so I asked them to check these boxes in the handout that you have, and then I collected all the data, and then I aggregated it, put it together, and counted how many students checked each particular box, and then gave number values to it. And so you as individuals can see it. I've coded it by color according to quartile. And so the top quartile of the whole field are in the dark red, and then it scales down to the bottom quartile, which is the lightest one. So does that make sense in terms of what's going on? Okay. So the red then is where the majority of students put themselves for those pieces. And you can see, in general, they're, for the most part, they're kind of on the left side and in the middle left. Except on writing, which students put themselves a little higher than everything else. So then we're going to move on to the midterm assessment. So this is the very middle of the class, in which they did essentially what you have handed out to you once again. And this time they got to do a lot of other stuff because it was comparative rather than just one piece in time. Because they were thinking, how has it changed? Or then it allowed me to look at how it changed over time. So we're going to move from this slide to the next one. And there's way more data, in part because I'm asking them to say which assignments helped you develop those competencies. So that's checking those boxes. And then whether they felt like they've gone up or down in terms of the ability to do that thing. And then here, whether they've kind of qualitatively changed the way they think about that competency itself. Because as they start doing these things, they start to realize sometimes, and I can let you speak for that, that the task that I'm asking them to do is either more complex or quite different from how they conceived of it beforehand. I don't know if you want to speak that, but you don't have to.
Well, I mean, just in terms of realizing that maybe I didn't have what I thought I had started out with, just in terms of changing my way of going about something or my approach to something. So I guess that could be seen in the negative or the changing.
It's kind of like the more you know, the less you know.
Yeah. The more you realize.
The more you realize you know, the less you actually know. So as we
Yeah.
started to go through these, you know, the readings, and as people started to go out into their field visitations and out into the field, they started to realize, oh my God, the food system, evidently much larger than I thought it was. You know, all of the ways, all the intricate ways that it ties into the rest of the world. I think became a little overwhelming at times. Jeremy, maybe not.
I thought it was really exciting to do the competencies mid-quarter and understand the language in the language that Ryan uses in the handout, and having a better grasp of that, and like actually identifying those skills as skills rather than just something that people do, or like just
Yeah. Because the first time that we handed it out, a lot of people had no idea what we were talking about. That, like, a good third of the left-hand side of understanding, you know, ways of knowing, understanding your values.
Right.
Did you have a question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
No, what I was going to ask is, do students ever admit that they don't know anything? That writing score is a good example, because if you ask students how is their writing, they all say it's wonderful. But if you start reading what they wrote, it's pretty hopeless.
It's really interesting because a lot of students, the first time that we handed this out, people are like, is this going to be graded? That was a big question. They were like, is this going to be graded? And we were like, nope.
That's
Nope,
what-
it's not.
The decoupling of the grades from the self-assessment and that.
Was really huge.
Yeah.
So by the second time that it came around, they took us seriously. They were like, okay, it's not going to be graded. I'm going to downgrade myself.
If we watch the writing from the next piece, you'll see there's actually some decrease in terms of where people rate themselves, and then by the end it's back up. So
Thankfully.
it's really interesting in a way. But yeah.
How much feedback were you able to give them on their writing?
You know, I can really speak to that
Yeah,
because the TAs did a lot of the grading. Since I only had 15 students, there were 3.5 sizable writing projects that took place over the time of the quarter. But because I had the ability to only do 15 of them, I gave a lot of feedback. I mean, Jenna can speak to it. She was in my lab, so yeah, we were. I mean, I can send you some of them if you want to see them or something, but yeah, I did track changes
I'm just
and.
maybe you didn't contribute to their lowered self-esteem on the writing.
Maybe, I don't
Towards
know.
the-
I think, I mean, it depends on the individual. I think there were a lot of students who were performing at really high levels already when they came into the class, so it's harder to critique those.
Did you ever use the technique I've used in some writing assignments where we, like you, we have them turn it in early, we grade it, but then I give the students a chance to make up the problems they've missed and get half the points that they had lost by redoing it, resubmit.
That was not that particular strategy wasn't available. What we did, the outline that they turned in was not graded. So they turned in an outline, and they could have as much feedback on that outline as they wanted to in the period before it was
So
due.
this would be the final paper.
Yeah.
We graded them. We had an outline, had a statement of what they're going to do, then an outline, and then paper.
Haven't done that
It's
yet, but-
slightly different, but it's a good idea.
Yeah, it is.
I should write it down. Yeah, so they got a lot of students took advantage of getting feedback before the outline was ever due. And then when they had the outline approved, they felt pretty confident about the way that their essay was going to go. And we did that for both the midterm and the final exam, which were both papers.
And then like in terms of like from a student's perspective, you had as much time because the assignments were given to you 4 weeks ahead of time to really be working on those and to be seeking help. And so if you were, you know, on top of it, you had all of this time to be working on that, which was really, I think, very helpful and important to realize whether or not you were taking advantage of that.
And then it's more the responsibility of the student to seek out the help because it's definitely available.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we want to shift all the burden of responsibility.
I want to address the students saying whether or not they're bad at something. I think that's a really important question because part of for me, and I think other students from talking to them, part of what was the transformative experience of the class was developing the ability to critically self-assess. So maybe at the beginning, it felt more strange to mark yourself down in a category, and I think maybe as we developed our sense of agency in over our own education, it in a way it becomes easier to like be honest about marking yourself down on a category, or like realizing that you're deficient in something, and also while you're identifying your skills.
And it's interesting because there were some students who didn't do well in the class, for sure. It was not like everybody was at a high performing level, but they still came to class, and they still came to lab, and they still participated in the group experiences. And at the end of the day, they were like, we would have taken it anyway, even if you're going to give us a D. And I mean, I've never been in a situation with students that are so excited about whatever's going on in the class, they continue to show up even though they're not going to pass. They're like, they're still there, you know, they're still showing up. It was like, it really blew me away. And I think that that's part of it. You're critically assessing, and you're like, well, at the end of the day, is it important that I pass or that I don't pass, or that I access this body of knowledge that I'm really interested in? It's a totally different way of looking at education.
And one thing I wanted to point out is this one down here at the bottom of the inquiry process, in terms of identifying gaps in current knowledge and perspective. I didn't realize I was teaching towards that until one of my students for the first time said, I think this is the most important thing I learned in this class, was to try to figure out what I don't know, and then also what I'm missing from the current way I'm thinking about something. So that's why I added it in, because of her comments there, saying that was a really key part. So do we want to do more kind of stop motion stuff? But actually, before we go on from this, what I wanted to point out for me as an instructor that I like a lot about this is that it allows me to see which assignments did what, according to students, how they felt, whether or not that thing that I thought they were going to be getting out of it, actually they got out of it. And also, it also kind of lets me see whether there are things that I was deficient in helping students do. If they didn't move very far on something, it's just kind of an indicator for me as to whether or not I did something fairly well. And so if you look at, I guess, structure and agency, it moves up a little bit, but not much, certainly. And then some people actually feel like they're worse at understanding it. So for that reason, it's something to highlight for the next class, certainly, in terms of delving into those relationships more. But some other potential take-home messages, at least for me, is that I think from these self-assessments we can see that students' analysis of their own learning, suggesting that they themselves see themselves as developing these competencies, which I think is fairly nice. Also, students change their conceptualization of what it meant to do a specific thing as we went through the class. Of course, they learned much more about the concepts and the knowledge that was embedded in that competency. I think the course did a fairly good job of facilitating the development of some competencies and a poor job on many others. And then arguably, I think, and this we can have Jenna and Jeremy speak too, and they have a little bit, but I think the self-assessments get into a deeper or broader level of learning than just assessing the demonstrations on their own by themselves. So I think those are important for me, and why I would kind of keep the pieces there, and will do so in the future, even though it's a lot of work, because I think there's a lot of interesting things going on that are worthwhile. Looking at course evaluations, I've only taught the class twice, from 2008 to 2009. The kind of radical departure on many fronts from, in terms of the assignments and expectations, including the exams and the lab, the teamwork, many of those things are unexpected. So it makes a lot of sense for me that these are fairly low, because expectations, these are not normal expectations in some ways. This I have mixed feelings on, in terms of whether there should be sufficient time in class for questions, because we talk a lot, we dialogue a lot. But one of my goals is to have them ask questions and pose questions beyond and outside, to realize that what we're doing in the classroom is a small subset of what they can actually do. So if we had time for all the questions they had, that would be problematic. I think. Anyway, of course, assignments, there's mixed feelings on those, certainly, because a lot of them are fairly new kinds of things. I think they are learning a lot, at least according to themselves, which is nice. The course score is much lower than me as an instructor, certainly. And I interpret that as it being fairly different in a lot of ways, and not everyone appreciating how much work we're asking them to do, certainly. So the change, though, I mean, the positive thing is I learned something between here and here, I think, and it's reflected in these things, which is I I changed a lot of the labs to make them more intensive and make them more field-based. And then we also made the competencies explicit from the very beginning. Because I developed them in 2008, I just never had students do self-assessment, nor did I show them exactly what the substructure was of everything I was asking them to do. So I think revealing that substructure and saying there is a logic to all of this craziness was really helpful to have them understand that the things we're doing are, I think, important. And so I think for those reasons, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, the one thing I'd want to add is just to show that the increase from 2008 to 2009, we were able to have mid-course evaluations. So we were able to say this is or is not what is working for me as a student. And then, I mean, the very next day, Ryan addressed what we had said and had, you know, changed his policies to meet our needs, which I think really shows that the learning is for the students. And I think that's important, to change the teaching to match what we wanted to get out of the class.
I would also add, there's some things I didn't change, but I was able to explain why I didn't change them also. So that dialogue around why I'm doing this certain thing and won't change it for any reason is, I think, really important also. So both of those components, I think, we got out of that. One of the final things we did as a class during the final assessment period was I realized that our evaluations have 15 numbers on them, but there's actually 20 slots on the Scantron to fill in. So keeping with the idea of self-assessment in some fashion, I posed the question to the class, how do you want to evaluate this class? What are the questions you would like to ask of this class and how it did, and then you can rate it and assess it itself. And so we had the normal 1 through 15, but then we brainstormed for about 10 minutes together as to what questions students wanted to ask about the class and how they wanted to evaluate it. So these were the questions they come up with. They are the Likert scale prompts, which is I gained incentives and abilities to continue lifelong learning, which was great for me to have that come out of the conversation because that's one of my pedagogical goals. So that was lovely. And then the class provided opportunities for experiential learning, and of course that's very high because we did so much field trips and analysis of those. I felt involved and engaged in the learning process. This one, a more self-critical one. This form inadequately measures my learning experience, in which there was quite a bit of agreement there, but some disagreement. And then the learning style used in this class helped me learn more and more deeply. Also received a fairly high score. So for me, it was, as an instructor with many of these goals, it was nice to have them come out of those conversations with students as to how they wanted to assess the class. Some comments related to the competencies as the base or substructure. I'm learning, not just being taught, which I didn't understand that first, and then I got it. And then this one in terms of the learning process and kind of making that explicit to them and having many of them appreciate that taking the learning process seriously can help. And then this one in terms of this is what you appreciate most. There are lots of learning methods like lecture, field trip, writing, reading, group discussion, and then I learned theory as well as real world, so coupling those things together. And then, thanks to Leslie and the Teaching Resources Center, we did both the mid-quarter evaluation to do some mid-course corrections, but we also did a final one to figure out both what they liked most and least of the class as a whole, and we were able to customize it and add questions of our own. And one thing that the TAs really wanted to know, and they certainly convinced me quite quickly, is what was the most valuable learning experience or assignment and why was one of the questions we added. We also did the least favorite, and then we asked, because we're making them work so hard, what feels like busy work? What is actually not helping you at all? So the field trips came out very highly here of almost half the students. The exams, surprisingly, almost a third of the class said those are the most important, valuable learning experience for the whole class. The diary, similarly. And then the readings, which you would expect to be very low, aren't that high. But this is asking students, what is your favorite thing, most valuable learning experience? To have readings fairly high is fairly interesting. And to me, it speaks to a variety of ways of learning, right? And that students are going to prioritize different pieces of the class depending in part on how they learn. So that was fairly interesting to see also. Okay, maybe the question that should be addressed since you're all here, and I appreciate you being here, is if this sounds like anything that's worthwhile doing, how do we get started? And this was a question I had to deal with for a long time and grappled with, and with help from Damien Parr, who's now in the back of the room, and with help from Leslie and others, and also Lori Thorpe at Michigan State University. I, as a new professor with very little experience teaching, was able to go through a process of trying to identify these competencies, with them guiding me, and then work towards answering this question, which is, what do I want my students to be able to do after they finish this class? So rather than just what should they know, what are the things that they as humans should be able to do? And so this, of course, once I have these questions fleshed out, work towards the specific goals, kind of the larger groupings, which I showed you, and then the more specific components of those larger groupings. And then that list, as I've been explaining, becomes the basis on which I develop the activities and assignments. And again, we compare those activities to see if they're going to be helping develop those goals.
So I just wanted to speak, you mentioned it a little bit. I think one of the additional points to this is that Ryan had a lot of support. It was like a group team project underneath that. And I just wanted to acknowledge, because there's a bunch of people in the room who helped that happen. He mentioned Damien Parr, who was very helpful in creating a lot of the knowledge and kind of the impetus to have a class like this with the Delphi survey that Mark Van Horn, who's also in the back of the class, worked on. And I mean, aside from creating the ideas of competencies and figuring out what they wanted to teach the class wouldn't exist without, the help of ASI, Ryan's new professorship. Tom Tomich is the director of ASI, he's right there. And then with all of the the TAs and the students kind of along for the ride in the, in helping create it underneath it, It wasn't just a class that started as a class and then it was taught all the way along. Like, it was already set. It was continually revised and updated through this collaborative network of people who were working on it. And I mean, it was an immense and powerful experience to be part of that network.
Yeah. Supporting Ryan. So that's why I flipped the slide to the acknowledgments, because as someone new to teaching and new to professorhood, generally it's extremely daunting to try to create a brand new class from nothing, with actually no standardized curriculum around that particular class. So for that reason and many others, I was able to draw on Damien's expertise and that of many others, in which we jointly created many of these things. So Damien, off the bat, pretty much the start of 2008, we were working together for most of that year. I received a very generous award from the Teaching Resources Center that helped me develop this. Maggie Lichter, who's not here, unfortunately, she's doing an independent major in sustainable agriculture and food systems. She was a check also as we developed things to say, Maggie, what do you think about this from a student perspective? And then Lori Thorpe, of course, who I've mentioned a few times. The TAs were very supportive. Leslie, in terms of doing all sorts of evaluation and then kind of guiding me through what that means too, who's been extremely helpful. And then many of these folks were involved in the summer of 2009, and after I taught the class the first time, taking the feedback from that, redesigning the class in some fashion, different pieces of it, to try to meet the strongest critiques from the student perspective of what happened. And so that was a joint effort over summer with Mark Van Horn, Heidi Ballard in education, Damien, Jesse a little bit, Maggie, and also Julia. And so I had never jointly designed a class before. It was a really powerful experience, because when we would have our meetings, we didn't have that many, but we had maybe 3 or 4 during the course of the summer that were, it was a little rocky at the start, but then as we got going, as a team, we started to really bounce some interesting ideas off each other, and some really great things came out of that meeting, including that kind of iterative cycle of students doing field work and then coming back and reporting that came out of that revision. So.
Yeah, and it speaks to the whole methodology of the class, which is a learned experience in a group of people. And so the creation of the class was much like the outcome of the class, which was a continued learned experience with a group of people. And I think because students knew that we were learning and creating and learning with them, they were that much more excited to share their experience with us. They were like, this is great. You guys are learning too. You're actually interested in this, and you want to take your holiday and go for a field trip? All right. We're all in the same cycle. So that was really very cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to add, too, that I received an email with lots of exclamation points from Leslie after she had met with you and the students and got a sense of the excitement that we've just been hearing about, saying that you'd make a great team of presenters at the Faculty Mentoring Faculty Program. And I think that that's another element, another service that the TRC provides, and that is that we not only go out and support the faculty, but we gather information about our best innovators who are doing interesting work. And this and the other programs that we offer give us a chance to share that information so that we can all learn from the innovation and experimentation that's going on in our classes, and all give us something new to think about and to try. But I want to make sure to leave some time for some more questions and conversation. So let's hear it. Yes.
Yeah, I congratulate the whole team on what you've done. This is fascinating to me. I've been teaching for over 25 years, and never actually, in the sciences, you're often dumped into a teaching role, never having studied any teaching theory or educational theory, and so you just get up there and do what you had done to you.
Same in social science generally.
And so the concept here is fascinating. I was just wondering if as I'll take this back to my department, if there's not that maybe the TRC has like a Cliff's Notes of how do you proceed to set this kind of go through this process.
That's a really good question. I think the first thing we would do is ask Ryan if he'd be willing to share his PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, absolutely.
And he offered us a number of first steps to start to think about it. But after you've looked that over and thought about it and chatted about it with some colleagues, to come talk to us at the TRC, come talk to the professional staff, that we'd be very glad to sit down with you, figure out what your outcomes, what your objectives are for a particular class or a new mode of teaching. We can provide studies and books that will give you some background, and then start to sketch out a class with you and think about what are your activities, what are your assignments, what are different ways beyond just lecturing that you can involve your students in their own learning process in the way that Ryan and his team have done. So we'd be glad to have those conversations with you, and the TRC stands ready to offer those sort of consultations.
Would you or Leslie be the contact person for that?
Mm-hmm. You can really talk to any one of the three of us, including Michaela Hunsinger. And I'd say that Michaela and Leslie have done a really good job of working with teaching assistants and postdocs, often in the sciences, who haven't had as much teaching experience, because we do a really good job of bringing in money for grants that can put our graduate students and postdocs right to work on important research. But they often go into the classroom then without having even practiced teaching as graduate students. And therefore, we have lots of workshops and presentations and classes even that can help our junior faculty prepare to do the teaching that's necessary. So, yes.
One very quick point. One of the absolutely crucial things that the TRC provides that we just cannot do for ourselves is to have a third party who to do evaluation. So I just want to put that out there. Aside from all the other beneficial things in terms of developing pedagogy, curriculum, that to have Leslie to have been able to come in and do our midterm and our final evaluations, there's just we can't do that ourselves. That's absolutely crucial.
And it's liberating for the students to be able to talk about a class without any concern about ramifications. That the class will only improve from that conversation having taken place. Yes?
So this is a little bit of a speculation question, Ryan. So you had an interesting situation where you have 30 students, 3 TAs, you said, so you have an enormous staff allocated. It's sort of like the liberal arts college model of teaching, which some of us have talked about better anyway. But can you speculate a little bit about how this goes forward, or how we move this into a larger classroom setting where we know that's not the standard allocation? What do you see kind of, I guess I'm looking for specifics based on your evaluation and the student's perspective. What could go and what must stay in order to maintain what you think is the effective? I mean, that seems to me the most useful way of branching out is actually identifying that sort of thing.
Right.
To classes that are 80 with 1 TA or 100.
And that is, in a lot of ways, the critical question as we move forward, in that there's pressure on me to certainly increase the size of the class, certainly. And I'm fine doing that. So with the labs are central. They have to stay. Without the lab experience, there's no way this would happen.
As 15 out of 30 told you.
What's that?
As 15 out of 30 students told you.
Yeah,
Lab's
yeah.
the number one.
Yeah, it's got to stay. And so I think we can go towards getting about 20 students per lab before we reach a scale that's beyond kind of the learning community that I would want ideally in there. And so I could see kind of getting to 20 or 20, maybe 25 max per lab, which would mean putting the class at close to 60 to 75 students. And then, of course, the question will be burdened on TA. What are we going to leave? What are we going to drop? What am I going to do? And certainly, I think we could drop the reading notebooks without anybody
saying anything
about that.
It's a whole lot of work for not a lot of payback.
Yeah. And then what I see happening, I think, is that as I get closer to tenure and as my time, in a way, frees up, although I don't necessarily see that happening. In my ideal world, somehow I become more efficient at doing everything I do. All right. That if that is the case, then I can be more involved in some of the outline feedback and some of the actual grading as well. And because for me, that's a really key portion of the class to be able to keep that students being able to come in to talk to me, to talk to the TAs about their outlines, ask questions about the exam questions. So I need to keep that piece. The reflective essay is really, really interesting and really a useful portion as well. So I would have to keep that as well, which means a lot of grading also. So that's a question I'm going to be asking myself and Damien and maybe Tom, if he's interested, over summer to say, what are we going to drop?
Well, I mean, the other option is to move to a model where the goal is to continue with seed funding to support that kind of thing at the level of the college.
Yeah.
To answer that, I mean, that's already the model that we have for this major. But
and that's how I've gotten TAs so far.
Yeah, my question though is if the unit for scaling is the lab, then I guess my comment is that has implications that we should be thinking about complementary graduate programs so that we have a community of graduate students who can effectively lead those labs and cater for a larger community of undergraduates.
Yeah.
You know, and I actually think we can do that with upper division students. I was just talking to my daughter last night, who's a senior at a liberal arts college, and she's TAing a class for the 3rd time.
Wow.
Well, she took it once. She's the 2nd time she's TA'd it, and you know, I mean, she's totally able to do that. But she said, I really know that material now. Yeah. So, you know, you learn by teaching, right? So I think that's another way we can maybe engage our upper division undergraduates.
Well, then there's the problem of the TA union. I mean, there's union issues with graduate students.
Yeah.
Speaking as a graduate student TA, who's like very much interested in continuing to teach.
And I think you have to be really careful when you talk about bringing in larger numbers of graduate students in an interdisciplinary PhD or master's program, speaking as someone who has interdisciplinary degrees and has found it incredibly difficult to find the kind of employment that, I mean, aside from here, that I've wanted and that my peers have had the same problem. So you have to be really careful in terms of like, yes, you're bringing in graduate student labor to teach your classes, but what are they going to do when they graduate with all the student loan debt? And I'm not just talking about the down economy, I'm talking about across decades.
Krishna?
It's wonderful you are able to do this in a class and you have the resources. I want to address the comment you made that you have never seen a class like this taught on the campus. For more than 12 years now, Davis Honors Challenge, we have been teaching courses exactly like this, with all the components, increasing their critical thinking, their presentation skills, writing skills, all the whole jazz. And we have faculty workshops every week. Those who teach get together and talk about how to improve those things. And it had worked very well. It's good Pat is here. I don't know what's going to happen with the budget cuts at this point. But that's a program that has been doing this for very effectively for more than 12 years now.
Good, thank you. Yes?
Oh, I have a very practical question. I'm seeking advice. It will be my first time to teach undergraduates. My major job is doing research and teach graduate and postdocs. So for this undergraduate, I'm going to teach bioelectricity, biomechanics. And I'm thinking, you know, one critical skill science students often missing is the teamwork. You know, in school they pretty much learn individually. So I'm thinking to have this component, have them to do some teamwork, and also at the end of the course to do a 10 minutes effective scientific presentation. Then I'm thinking how to grade that. Would the instructor give the grades, or should it be graded by the whole class? So I wonder, from your experience, is it a good idea to have students to grade other students, or it's better to the instructor decides?
Can I add something to this? In Davis Honors Challenge, we have a component where students grade each other. So it's not a total. So around the 30% you can decide what percentage that grade comes from fellow students. Everyone grade each student individually, confidentially, send it to the instructor, so you collect that, and then you also grade based on the writing, their presentation, and so forth. So you could have that, and that works very well.
And they can be fair.
Oh, they can be fair.
It's a matter of having a really good rubric.
Yeah,
for your
exactly.
handling of students. That makes very clear what an A level is, what a B level is, and what well defined each of the characteristics you're looking for in the grades.
So I think we should acknowledge the fact that we're 5 minutes over, and I know a lot of people have to go. But if you want to stay and have a conversation, I don't teach till 2, so I can be here for another 25 minutes.
I'll also take just a moment to announce that next week, Carly Arnett from German and Russian will be here. This is someone who Winder McDonald is recruited for us to give a talk on teaching language classes. And some of the strategies used in language classes are analogous to what we've been talking about, right? What can we do in smaller groups? How can we include activities in our classes and not just listen to lectures? How can we immerse our students in the culture of whatever the discipline is? So I hope that you all will come back a week from today. And I'd also like to just take a moment to thank Ryan and his team for such an excellent presentation. Well done.
Did you practice before?
Actually, no.
No practicing.
I've gotten much better presenting since starting teaching.
That was wonderful, Ryan.